Hey everyone, and welcome to the last lecture of Unit 1. And today we're going to be talking about the integumentary system. And this is Chapter 5 in your textbook. So today we're going to be talking about the skin. So the skin is considered your integumentary system along with the appendages of the skin. So I know appendages sound kind of funny, but what is that? That is your fingernails and your hair. So we've got some layers to the skin that we'll talk about. We'll talk about the epidermis and the dermis, what the differences are, and what's important about each one. We'll talk about the hypodermis, which is technically not part of the skin, but it's also very important to the skin. Then at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about disorders of the integumentary system, such as skin cancer, burns, such as that, and then a little bit about skin development. So you might wonder, of course we're talking about skin, and skin is the largest organ in the body, which is kind of odd to think about. We don't really think about the skin as an organ, right? You would maybe think, oh, it's got to be the intestines or the lungs or the liver, something like that, a visceral organ, that what we consider to be an organ. But the skin is an organ. It has a couple different tissue types that come together to make an organ, so we'll talk about that. It does account for 7% of your body weight, so that's a lot, right? If you think about just one individual organ accounting for that much body weight. And we'll talk about the difference in thick skin versus thin skin. So there's actually an extra layer in thick skin. And you might think, okay, where would there be thick skin in the body? Kind of think about it. Where might you need some extra protection? Also maybe where you don't find any hair. That's right, your hands or your palms and your feet. So the skin can vary in thickness. So you can get some thinner skin at like 1.5 millimeters to some thicker skin around 4 millimeters or so. And we divide the skin into two very distinct layers. And so that's the epidermis and the dermis. So if we look at our drawing over here, a drawing of skin, we'll see that there's very distinct layers. So up at the top, this is the epidermis. And you see it kind of dive down and wrapping around that hair follicle. So that is all epidermis. So the hair follicle is part of the epidermis. So the epidermis is just this top layer, okay? Then you can kind of see how it can separate from the dermis underneath. And if you notice, that's kind of where all the stuff is, right? So there's blood vessels, there's nerves, there's these glands that we've seen, even a muscle. And then underneath the dermis is the hypodermis. So the hypodermis itself is not considered part of the skin or part of the integumentary system, but it is very important to the skin. Okay, so it is made up of fat or adipose connective tissue and areolar connective tissue. So if you remember way back, right, we were talking about all those different tissue types, right? So we talked about loose connective tissue. So there's kind of more ground substance in that extracellular matrix versus all those fibers, right? So it's loose. So both adipose and areolar connective tissues are some of our loose connective tissues. And so that's what is made up of that hypodermis underneath. And the dermis itself is also a connective tissue, and so we'll talk about the epidermis and the dermis as their different tissue types. So let's first talk about the epidermis. So if we remember back, we were talking about those different types of epithelial tissue, right? So the epidermis is a type of epithelium, and it's that stratified squamous epithelium, meaning lots of layers, right? So many layers. We just have a picture over here. So this whole thing here is the epidermis. You can see a clear delineation between the epidermis and the dermis underneath. Kind of this pink tissue underneath, that's the dermis. And all these tightly packed cells above it is the epidermis, which is epithelial tissue. And we notice up at the top, right, is this kind of weird layer. They don't really look like cells. That's keratin. Okay, so we'll talk about what keratin is. So it's a keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. It's for protection, okay? And there's 4 main cell types. So if we look at our picture, right, we see these distinct cells. These guys kind of all look the same, right? They're the keratinocytes. Then we have these guys down here that are a different color, different shape. They are melanocytes, okay? So the melanin producing ones. And we'll talk about each of these individual cells in a minute. Then we have this other type that looks kind of funny, and that's the dendritic cells. We'll talk about what they do. And then last but not least, we have these tactile epithelial cells, and that's part of the nervous system. So it attaches down to a neuron. So what are these different cell types? Let's go through them individually. So first, we're going to talk about the keratinocytes. They're the majority of the cells in the epidermis. Okay, so they are those squamous epithelial cells. Okay, remember we're talking about the stratified squamous epithelium. So these guys are located in kind of the middle layer of the skin. And we'll talk about the different layers of the epidermis of the skin in a minute. So this will make more sense, but just to have an idea, it's making up that middle layer. And what's the main function of these guys? Just like the name says, it produces keratin. And keratin is this tough fibrous protein. Okay, so it is going to be what's going to make up that keratin layer at the top of the skin. Okay, and it's again the most abundant cell type. Okay, and so as the cells divide and develop, they're going to move from the bottom layer of the epidermis all the way to the top. And finally, when they get to that top and create that layer of keratin, they're going to be dead cells. Okay, I know a lot of you have always heard, you know, you're sloughing off dead skin cells all the time, right? And that's what these guys are. These are those keratinocytes that have reached the top of the layer of the epidermis and they're no longer alive. They're dead skin cells. And what's left is really just that keratin, okay? Making this protective layer on the top of your skin. Now our next cell type are melanocytes. And these guys live at the bottom layer of the epidermis. And these guys produce and secrete melanin. Okay? And melanin is what gives skin its pigment. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about melanin. And these guys only produce the melanin. And then what happens is they secrete it and it gets picked up by the keratinocytes. So the melanin actually stays in the keratinocytes. So it gives it to the keratinocytes all amongst that whole middle layer of the epidermis. And that's what's helping you, it protects you from the UV light, okay? Gives you some pigmentation to the skin and protects from UV, okay? Now our next cell type is the tactile epithelial cells. So these guys are also found in that basal or bottom layer of the epidermis. And these guys, like I said, are attached to a nerve ending. So what do you think these guys do? Tactile, meaning touch, right? And they're attached to a nerve ending, a sensory nerve ending. So this is what allows you to be able to feel touch, right? So if someone touches your skin, you're able to feel it, right? And then the last but not least, we have dendritic cells. Okay, and these guys are in the middle layer and the basal layer. They kind of roam around the epidermis. Okay, and they're part of the immune system. So these guys are kind of like macrophages, which essentially they eat things. So they go around the skin and just make sure there's, you know, if anything is there that it's not supposed to be there, such as bacteria or a virus or anything, they eat them. Okay, And then they take them back to the immune system and say, hey, look what I found. Maybe you guys need to mount an immune response to get rid of whatever this infection may be. So this is kind of the first line of defense in your skin. Okay. So the first layer we're going to talk about is the stratum basale. So on the right we have a histological slide, which is more what you would see under the microscope. You can see those individual keratinocytes. You can see the dermis underneath. And so the first layer is really at that division between the dermis and the epidermis. Okay. So these cells are going to be attached to that basement membrane. And we said that basement membrane is what delineates the epidermis and the dermis and is made up of both tissues, right? So what is happening down here in the stratum basale? Well, these guys are the mitotically active cells, so they're going to be the ones that are dividing. So they're the stem cells that are going to divide and produce more keratinocytes, more epithelial cells. Okay, so these guys are all going to be dividing down here, and then they're going to move their way up through the epidermis until they die and are up at the top and just become keratin. Okay. And we do see those melanocytes sitting through here and those tactile epithelial cells. So the ones that are going to be producing the melanin, as well as those nerve cells that allow you to be able to feel touch. So the next layer is the stratum spinosum. And it's kind of named after this spiny appearance under the microscope, but I don't really see, maybe you can see these little lines, and those are really the junctions between the keratinocytes. Remember we said epithelial cells are smashed up against each other, and they have those things that unify them or bring them together, and some of those are called desmosomes, right? We had those 3 different junctions, and desmosomes are one of them. And so those little lines that you see are actually desmosomes, which is kind of interesting that you can actually see them. Okay, so this whole layer is the stratum spinosum. So it's the biggest layer made up of all those keratinocytes. You do see some dendritic cells in amongst the keratinocytes, but I couldn't tell you like here's one, right? But you may find them in amongst these keratinocytes. And essentially what these guys are doing is they're producing these pre-keratin filaments, okay? So just think they're producing that keratin, which is going to eventually be this layer up at the top, okay? So now our next layer is the stratum granulosum. Okay, so what's happening up at the stratum granulosum? And these are probably the flattest layer of cells. So if you see, this is one cell, and it truly is very squamous in shape. It's flattened out, and it's only a few layers of cells. And what happens is this is where the cells start to die. Okay, so they're far enough away from the dermis, which has the nutrient and blood supply, that it can't quite make it to the top. So these cells are starting to die. Okay, and then they're going to be completely dead when they reach that the last layer. And what's also cool is, how if you run water over your skin, it just beads up and falls off, right? Your skin is waterproof, right? And this is where this happens. So your keratinocytes actually are producing this glycolipid. A glycolipid is just a sugar fat, okay? And so you don't need to know the specific thing or anything, but just know that your skin is waterproof, and this is why, right? So you produce this glycolipid up here, which is creating a waterproof layer to your skin, okay? So then anything above this stratum granulosum is going to be dead, okay? Because it's too far away from the nutrient supply. And that brings us to our last layer, the stratum corneum. And so this guy is that layer of keratin right at the top, okay? And this is just a layer of dead keratinocytes, okay? And it's a thickened plasma membrane just full of keratin. That's all it is. It's kind of gotten rid of all the other organelles, and it's pretty much just keratin and those glycolipids, okay? So this is really why we're protected against, abrasion, penetration, water, all that stuff. It makes it a very strong protective layer against the outside world. Obviously not against everything, but too bad it weren't, right? So that's the stratum corneum, is made up of just these dead keratinocytes. And that's what you're sloughing off every day, are these dead skin cells. But you're always producing new ones down at the stratum basale, so it's a continuous turnover of skin cells. So now remember we said there are areas on your body that have thick skin versus thin skin. And we said that that thick skin has an extra layer. Well, what that extra layer is it's called the stratum lucidum. Okay? And it's really just an extra layer of dead keratinocytes. Okay? So it just gives you this extra layer of the stratum corneum. Okay? It's kind of similar to the stratum corneum, so it sits right in between the corneum and the granulosum, and that's the stratum lucidum. Okay, so it's just an extra layer of protection, and that's really only on your palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. So this is just comparing these layers between our picture on the right and that histological slide on the left, just kind of showing you a little bit about the different cells and the different layers of the epidermis. Okay, it's from your book. So now let's talk about the second layer of the skin, and that's the dermis. So we talked about the epidermis. So epi means above, so it's the more superficial layer, right? So epidermis kind of dives down around the hair follicle, but it's really that superficial layer of the skin. And we said that's epithelial tissue, right? So now we're going to talk about the dermis, which is a connective tissue. So it's a very strong and flexible connective tissue. And which connective tissue type did we say that was? So it's going to be that dense, irregular connective tissue. And why is that important? What did we say that irregular pattern gives us, right? Those fibers. So we said that those fibers are kind of going in every direction, right? So it really gives the skin a very flexible component so it can withstand forces in all directions, okay? And we said another great thing about connective tissue is that's what brings in all the blood supply and the nerves, okay? So it has a rich vasculature, okay, bringing in all that rich nutrients and oxygen up to the epidermis, okay? And this is really our hide, right? Just like an animal hide. And if any of you have tattoos, this is where the ink is injected for tattoos. So just in that dermal layer, okay? And we have two layers to the dermis itself. Okay, so we have the papillary dermis, which is what extends up into the epidermis. So think of these little ridges, these little bumps, kind of like an egg crate. Okay, I think some of you have maybe seen an egg crate or an egg carton, right, with those little ridges. So just that layer up there that's reaching up into the epidermis, that's interacting with the epidermis, that is the papillary dermis, like little papillae, okay? And then the rest of it, the majority of it, 80% of the thickness of the dermis is reticular dermis, okay? Reticular dermis. So now let's talk about those layers of the dermis in a little bit more detail. So what's important about the papillary dermis? Well, we know it interacts with the epidermis, right? So it's that egg crate, those little bumps or ridges that are going to poke up into the epidermis. Well, what does that do? Well, it increases the surface area, the contact surface area between the epidermis and the dermis. And why is that important? Well, this dermis is what's bringing in all that nutrient supply. So that means there's more surface area for gas exchange, nutrient exchange, right? Because we have to bring the nutrients and the gases to the epidermis from the dermis. Okay, so it allows for more gas exchange, more nutrient exchange, which is very important. But another thing that it does is that it's what gives us fingerprints. So you have fingerprints and fingerprints on your feet as well. So they call them fingerprints, but again, you have them on your toes and your feet as well. So anywhere where you have that thick skin, right, soles and palms, you're gonna find fingerprints. Okay, and so what are fingerprints? Why are they important? Well, essentially we have these little dermal papillae, right? So each of these little bumps is a dermal papilla. And so you have many papillae, which is plural. And essentially you're gonna think of a dermal ridge as a mountain. So it's gonna be these little dermal papillae on the dermal ridges. So if I get my pen, I might be able to show this a little bit better. Okay, so here's a dermal ridge, okay, kind of like a rolling hill, right? And then on top of that dermal ridge, you have the little dermal papillae. Okay, so the dermal papillae are what are interacting with the epidermis, but you see that there's this overall wave, right, because of those dermal ridges. But then if you think about the epidermis on top, right, let's get another color. So now the epidermis is following all these ridges, right? So the epidermis is just following those dermal papillae and the dermal ridges. And that's what's going to give you this fingerprint, right? So there's an epidermal and dermal ridge and a bump. Then you have a little valley in between, right? So these epidermal ridges are coming from that underlying papillary dermis, okay, which is part of that dermal ridge. And what happens is it really increases your kind of gripability. And I know you may not think, you know, of course humans can't like scale a wall like that. Maybe think of like a gecko or something like that, right? The stickiness of your hands and feet. And it may seem, you know, not important to us, but it is in the grand scheme of things, right? So it does increase our gripability in our hands and our feet, okay? But that's what makes fingerprints, which is kind of cool. So now let's talk about that second layer of the dermis, and that's that reticular dermis. So it's the thickest part. It's 80% of the dermis. And it's that dense irregular connective tissue. And what that dense irregular connective tissue does is it gives it that strength and flexibility, okay? And what happens is it creates these two different types of lines. So the papillary dermis has to do with your fingerprints, but then deep down you get these deeper lines throughout your skin, okay? And there's two different types. One you can appreciate every day. If you just look at your hand, right, and you kind of close your fingers and open them back up, you notice that where your fingers flex and where your hand and palm flex, you get these flexure lines, okay? Like if you've ever been to a palm reader, which I have never been, but of course they, you know, read these different lines, and what they're reading are these flexure lines. So everyone has flexure lines, they just might be a little bit different and individual, just like fingerprints, right? So those are flexure lines. Those are things we see every day and can appreciate. and that's caused by the reticular dermis. But we have this other thing called a cleavage line, and essentially it's the separation between the collagen fibers. So we said those collagen fibers are kind of going every which way, but they do have some separation, and they kind of go in lines. So if we look at our second picture over here, these are cleavage lines. So over the entire body you have these cleavage lines, and these are really important for giving the skin strength overall and trying to resist forces in these different directions. So they're better at maybe resisting force in these cleavage line directions. It's also really important for surgery and surgeons. You can create your incisions with the cleavage lines. It's kind of like cutting with or against the grains of meat, right? So if you cut with the cleavage line, it gives you a better healing, less scarring. So just something to think about more in the medical field. But another important thing about the reticular dermis is really it's what's bringing in that rich blood supply and nervous tissue. And that's really important for temperature regulation. So your skin is very important for temperature regulation, right? So that's why we sweat when it's hot, right? We're trying to release energy from our skin, and you can decrease the blood flow to your skin when you're cold, right? So increase blood flow when it's hot to get rid of that energy and heat, and decrease the blood flow when it's cold and keeping it to your organs. Right, your internal organs. As well as it's really important for sensation, right? We have like certain areas on our body, on our skin, are very sensitive. Some areas not so much, but it's really important for touch and sensation. So speaking of sensation, we're going to talk a little bit more about those tactile epithelial cells. Now there are a bunch of different types of them, but we are going to kind of just focus on two different types today. We're going to talk more about them when we get to the nervous system, because these are cells that are attached to sensory nerve endings. So they're part of the nervous system. Okay, but we find them in the epidermis and the dermis, okay? So our first type, and these are the two that we're going to talk about in the dermis. So we did talk a little bit about the ones we can find up in the epidermis, but we're not going to talk about those today. We're going to talk about the two of the three or so that are found, about four found in the dermis. So the first one is the tactile corpuscle. So I know this is kind of a weird word. Corpuscle, you don't pronounce the C. Corpuscle. So another name for them is the Meissner corpuscle, but tactile to me gives us a better idea of what it does. So these guys are more superficial, and they extend up into those dermal papillae. So this is part of that papillary dermis, right? The little bump that extends up into the epidermis. And that is going to be where this little tactile corpuscle is found. Okay, so it's superficial. So it's really going to be able to feel very light or sensitive touch. Okay, it's right under the epidermis, so it's very superficial, and it can really sense those very light touches. Versus our other one, which is called a lamellated corpuscle or Pacinian corpuscle. If you want to remember either one, I'm going to always refer to them as tactile and lamellated corpuscles, okay? And this one is found deeper in the dermis, okay? So it's deep in that reticular dermis, so it can sense deeper touch. So deep pressure, deep touch. Okay, so it's sitting, it has to have a little bit more force coming onto it for it to be able to pick up that sensation, okay? So now let's talk about the hypodermis. It is very important, even though it's not technically part of the integumentary system in the skin, but it is deep to the skin. So we said epi, kind of meaning above the dermis, hypo, meaning below or under the dermis, okay? And the hypodermis is made up of areolar and adipose connective tissue. So we said those are those two of our loose connective tissues. And adipose is important because it's fat, right? So what is the point of the hypodermis? Why is it important even though it's not part of the integumentary system? Well, what it does is it anchors the skin or the dermis to the underlying muscle tissue. So if we look at our top picture over here, which is kind of a gross anatomy picture of the skin, the layers of the skin on a cadaver, and we notice the epidermis, right, is our most superficial layer. Right below that, which is a little more pink, is the dermis. And then underneath that is the hypodermis, which is really our fat. And then we have kind of a deep fascial layer of the muscle, which is kind of dense regular connective tissue, which is like what tendons and ligaments are made out of. And then we have that muscle tissue underneath. So it helps to anchor that skin to the muscle tissue underneath. But what is fat really good at? It helps insulate the body. Okay, and of course the distribution is different between males and females of where you have more fat deposits throughout the body, of course, but really the whole point is to help insulate the body and help with thermoregulation. So now let's talk a little bit about the differences in skin color, right? So there are 3 different pigments that contribute to skin color. The majority of your skin color is due to melanin, right? And we think of melanin mostly as just being a brown pigment, but it does vary. It can vary from even a yellow to a red and brown to black. So there are various shades of melanin, and your melanocytes are what are producing the melanin. So they produce it, but then they transfer it to the keratinocytes. So all those epithelial cells, those keratinocytes throughout the epidermis contain melanin. And that's obviously what contributes mostly to your skin color. But there are 2 other things that are kind of interesting that you wouldn't maybe think about that has to do with some skin color. And that's hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is what makes your blood red. So your red blood cells contain a bunch of hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is red. So what happens is, especially in Caucasian or lighter colored skin, it contains less melanin. So melanin actually gets broken down in the skin, in lighter colored skin. And so it allows for the actual red color of hemoglobin to show through. So you're seeing that epidermis, you're seeing kind of through the epidermis to the dermis, that underlying dermis, which has the vasculature, the blood vessels, which is kind of interesting, right? So that's why we do get some reddish skin tones in some lighter colored skin. And something you may not think, and maybe you've only heard it as a wives' tale, right, is if you eat too many carrots, you're going to turn orange, right? Well, keratin or beta carotene is kind of a yellowish pigment that does come from carrots and tomatoes, and it can, affect maybe a little bit of your skin color, but not as much as maybe those old wives' tales tell us, right? But one thing that's really interesting with hemoglobin also is that's what causes the changes in color when you get a bruise, right? So what is a bruise, right? You get this obvious shade of kind of purples and greens and yellows. And what's happening under there? Well, when you get a bruise, right, you have a concussive force which breaks all the blood vessels so that hemoglobin actually escapes from the blood vessels. And as the hemoglobin gets metabolized, it's going to turn different shades of color with the different compounds it turns into. So hemoglobin is broken down. Well, hemoglobin itself is mostly red, but then as it dies and gets changed, it turns kind of into these lovely bluish purple colors. And then it changes into biliverdin. Biliverdin for green, so that turns into green, and then into bilirubin, which is more of a yellow. So as the healing process goes through, that hemoglobin is broken down into these different compounds, which have different colors, which is kind of interesting. So now let's talk a little bit about the appendages of the skin. So remember, appendages are just kind of a strange word for your hair and your nails, okay? So these guys are all epithelial tissue, and that's why I have it bolded and underlined, because some of these appendages reside in the dermis, but they are made up of the epidermis, or the epithelial tissue. Okay, so even though your nails and hair may invaginate or kind of turn inward and down into the dermis, if you notice, that outer layer of cells is the epidermis. Okay, same with the nail. So you have that nail bed down here, the nail root, and that is all epidermis. Okay, and that's the underlying dermis tissue under there. Okay, and hypodermis. Some are also just reside in the dermal tissue. Okay, they don't even look like they come from the epidermis, but they are epithelial tissue in origin. And those are some glands. So we'll talk about glands last. So let's go through our hair and nails first. So let's talk about the nail. Okay. So it's really made up of the epidermis, and it's just a modification of those epithelial cells, okay? And the difference is that our epidermis has a soft keratin on top. So remember we said the stratum corneum on top is just those dead keratinocytes full of keratin. Well, that is soft keratin. And the difference is your nails are made up of hard keratin. And they're a lot tougher, a lot more durable, and you don't flake off those keratinocytes, okay? You don't flake off those dead cells like you do in the skin. So it's a little bit different type of keratin between your nails and your hair and your skin. So if we look at our superficial kind of picture of the nail, there's some superficial anatomy. So the edge of your nail is really just the free edge. And then you have your nail plate, which is the majority of your nail that sits on top of your finger, right? And then you have these nail folds. Okay, so the lateral folds are on the side. Okay. And then in the back, you have a cuticle, right? Now the real name for a cuticle is eponychium. I know that's a very weird word, but there's your word of the day, right? Eponychium. Okay, is your cuticle. And right in front of the cuticle, you notice there's this kind of white, kind of half moon shaped, and that's your lunule. And that's the white area of your nail. Okay, so that's your new nail bed growing, and you can't quite appreciate the dermal tissue underneath, which gives it the color. The epidermal tissue is just too thick right there, and you can't see through it, okay, which is why it's white. So let's look at some deeper tissue layers of the nail. So we have our nail bed. Okay, so the nail bed is really that deep layer of epidermal tissue that the nail plate sits on top of. Okay, so this is all epidermal tissue, all epithelial tissue. Okay, and that's the nail bed. Okay. Now the nail matrix, which is down here, that's going to be at the root. So you have your nail root here, and it is embedded into that nail matrix. And this is where your nail grows from, which is from the nail matrix. Okay. So that's where all the cells are dividing, and then they're going to grow up through the nail root and come out the nail plate. Okay. And so again, right at that nail root, right at that lunule, which is where that new nail is being grown from, it's so thick that you can't see the dermis underneath. So the dermis has all that blood supply underneath, which has the blood vessels, and you can see all that pink tissue underneath. Okay. But right there, you can't quite see it, right at the lunule, where it's very, very thick, right in front of that cuticle or that eponychium. So that's pretty much it for nails, and let's switch gears and talk a little bit more about hair. So we're going to talk a little bit more about hair. There's a few more structures I want you to know about the hair. So same thing as the nail, it's made up of that hard keratin, right? So it's very tough, very durable. You're not sloughing off those dead cells like you are in the skin. So you can really divide the hair into two main parts, okay? And that's going to be the follicle, which is going to be anything under the surface of the skin, okay? So the surface of that epidermis, anything underneath that is considered the hair follicle. And that's what's embedded into that dermis. But again, it's epidermal tissue, okay? Just embedded into the dermis. And anything above the line of the skin, the surface of the skin, is going to be the shaft of the hair. Okay? So it's going to project above the skin. So now let's look at the hair follicle. So if we take a blow-up picture, we kind of just look at the hair. So we said the follicle is anything below the surface. So we're going to look at some of these layers of the hair follicle. So if we look at the outer layer, we have the follicular wall. Okay, so here's the follicle wall. And the big thing about the follicle wall is it's made up of both epithelial and connective tissue. Okay, so if we look at this, here's our connective tissue layer, and then we have our epithelial layer. Okay, don't worry too much about internal and external root sheath, right? So this whole thing is the hair root coming down within the hair follicle. Okay, just know that the wall is made up of both epithelial and connective tissue. It's kind of like the basement membrane, right, of the epidermis. So the hair root is that internal structure, right? So we have the wall, and then inside the wall is the root. And the root is made up of a couple of layers. And we'll talk about those layers in a minute. We'll look at a cross section through the root. But then this whole bulb down here, okay, so just this section is called the hair bulb. Okay, so it's the very deepest part of the hair follicle. Okay, and just like in our fingernail, we had a nail matrix where your new nail grows from, we have a hair matrix where the hair root is growing from. Okay, and we even have a dermal papilla. So remember, in our skin, we have dermal papilla that extends into the epidermis. Well, we have this little dermal papilla that extends up into the hair root. And that's where all the blood supply and nervous tissue is going to come up into, right? Because you can feel when a hair is pulled out, right, or moved, right? You can feel that. So you've got some nervous tissue wrapped around the bulb and the follicle, as well as these dermal papilla that bring up blood and nerve supply as well. And just like our skin has different colors, so does our hair, right? So we have melanocytes here producing melanin. So those are these little cells here, and they're going to produce the melanin, which will give us our different hair pigment. Okay. So now let's look at that cross section through the hair root. right? So let's review. This whole thing is the follicle, right? Anything underneath. The most bottom part is the hair bulb, and then that gives us that hair root that will become the hair shaft, okay? So we talked about the wall, right? The follicle wall being part connective tissue, part epithelial tissue, and that's the majority of the follicle right there. But then we have the root, which has 3 layers as well, okay? So what are those layers? The innermost layer is the medulla. Okay, it's kind of the core of the hair root. And then we have the cortex around that. Okay, and you'll see the words medulla and cortex in other organs. So medullas are always going to be the centers, the central cores, and the cortex is always going to be the more superficial layer, outer layer. Okay, so you'll see those words again in kidneys, ovaries, all kinds of organs we'll talk about. The outermost layer is the cuticle. Okay, so this is the most important layer for when we talk about kind of hair and hair care. Because what it is it's just a single layer of cells, but they overlap kind of like shingles on a roof. So if you ever have seen, shingles on a roof, they kind of overlap. And you want them to overlap the right way, otherwise you get split ends, roughened hair, right? So that's why we condition our hair to kind of lay those cells or those shingles back down, okay? So it's kind of that, what gives hair its integrity, okay? In the hair root, right, so that's what becomes that hair shaft, right? So that cuticle layer is going to be the outer layer of the shaft. It's maybe not the outer layer of the follicle because it's down inside the follicle down here, but once it's out and above the skin, it's going to be the outer layer, right? Okay, so that's why we care about it and condition it. Okay. So now there's a few more fun things to talk about hair. So when you get cold or scared and you get goosebumps, right? Your hair stands up on end. Well, there's actually a little smooth muscle in here that is attached to the follicle and up to the papillary dermis. And essentially what happens is this erector pili muscle, that's what it's called, when it contracts, so it shortens and it pulls the hair follicle so that the hair shaft stands right up on end, right? And that's how you get goosebumps, which is important, which kind of, when we were maybe more hairy back in the day, you would create more insulation with the hair if it is more puffed up, okay? But anyways, I digress. So there are 2 different types of hair on the body, right? Obviously, your arm hair is very different from the hair on the top of your head, right? So we have 2 different types of hair. Now, vellus hair is the soft body hair of women, mostly women and children, right? Your arm hair, okay? Men have more thick hair on their body, right? And they have more terminal hairs on their whole body, because terminal hair is really the hair of the scalp, your armpits, the axillary area, and your pubic area. Whereas men kind of have that all over their body, right? And women and children have the vellus hairs, the softer hairs. And there's another interesting thing about kind of hair and hair cycles. So each follicle, right? So each follicle goes through a growth phase, right? We all lose hair, right? Your hair falls out. So you have this active phase and resting phase. So there's a kind of a different, every hair has a lifespan, right? So it's going to grow, which is the active phase. It's going to rest, it'll be there, and then you're going to lose that hair and start all over again, And it's going to be different throughout your body. And of course, every 4 years you don't lose your entire head of hair. So each follicle is on a different cycle, right? But on your scalp, each hair follicle is probably shed every 4 years. Okay, which is kind of interesting. Whereas maybe in the eyebrow area, maybe a few months, or armpit or whatever. So they go through these follicular phases. And we also get hair thinning and baldness, right? Definitely due to aging. Mostly you get fewer hair, more hair falling out as we age. But again, in men and women do have a little bit of male pattern baldness, but usually more in males, it can be genetic, right? So you get hair thinning on the head in certain patterns. So last but not least, we're going to talk about glands. So these guys are going to really reside within the dermal tissue. But remember way back when we talked about glands in our epithelial tissue section, right? So we said the duct of the gland is always made up of the epithelial tissue. So that's what's going to connect that gland to the surface of the skin. And then the secretory cells of the gland are going to produce some sort of secretion, whether that's, sweat or oil. So we're going to talk about these different types of glands that we have in the skin and what their functions are. So our first type of gland is going to be a sebaceous gland. So these guys are our oil glands. Now we find these pretty much all over the body, except for on your palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. Okay, and you might think about that. So they're mostly associated with hair follicles. And where do we find hair follicles? Pretty much everywhere except our hands and our feet, right? We don't have hair on the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. At least I sure hope you don't, right? So these guys are associated with the hair follicle most of the time, okay? So remember we talked about our different types of glands, and they are simple alveolar glands. And so they look kind of like a little cluster of grapes, okay, sitting off. So here's our hair follicle, right? Sitting in the dermis, but it's all epidermal tissue coming down, okay? And so they sit right off to the side of that follicle, still made up of that epithelial tissue here. And it's going to connect up to the shaft of the hair, and it's going to come out right at the base of the hair. Okay. And so what happens is these sebaceous gland cells are going to be producing sebum. So sebum is that oily substance that comes out, and what it's supposed to do, right, is going to soften and lubricate our hair and skin, kind of keep it nice and not dry out, right? But the more sebum you produce, the more oily your skin is, right? And the more dirt it attracts. So teenagers produce a lot of extra sebum. And what happens is they collect more dirt, and maybe they're not as clean as other humans, right? So lots of dirt build up, which creates acne, right? So if we look at our picture, we have our drawing on the right, that we've been looking at. So if we have our hair follicle here, we've got our little sebaceous gland right off to the side, okay, those little grape clusters. Now if we look at a histological slide, here's our hair follicle coming down right here. Okay. And then off to the side, we see these secretory cells making up that sebaceous gland. Okay. So now we have a second type of gland, and those are our sweat glands. So they're all over the body, right? So widely distributed all around the body, even on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet, right? Your hands can sweat, right? So you do see them everywhere, unlike the sebaceous glands, which are really only associated with the hair follicles. So these guys produce sweat, which is just a blood filtrate. So what happens is it comes from the blood, so it's made up of very similar substances, like your blood plasma, but it doesn't have the blood cells in it, right? So no red blood cells or white blood cells. So mostly it's water, right? 99% water with some salts and maybe a few traces of metabolic wastes, okay, such as urea. Now we have two different types of sweat glands. So the most common type of sweat gland is the eccrine gland. So eccrine glands are the most numerous, and they are what produce true sweat. So all over your body, okay, you have eccrine glands. And this is really just your normal sweat, right? So mostly water, doesn't smell, okay? And it's just this little bundle of cells down here in the dermis, and then it opens up into a sweat pore on the skin, and the sweat comes out, right? Helping with thermoregulation, help cool off the body, all that good stuff. And our second type of gland, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, is our apocrine gland. And this is what produces the smelly sweat, right? BO is what we call it, right? Some people maybe smell worse than others, but everybody has apocrine glands. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. They can be associated with hair follicles or not, okay? So let's look at our picture. So if we have our drawing over here that we've been looking at, and we blow up one of these eccrine glands, looks kind of like spaghetti, right? So there's these little wormies or spaghettis of these secretory cells that are producing your sweat, right? And then it's going to go through a duct, and the duct that attaches up to the surface of the skin is what is that epithelial tissue, okay? Usually, you know, a simple cuboidal or maybe stratified cuboidal if it's a bigger gland, but usually these small sweat glands are simple cuboidal. So you see these simple cuboidal cells, okay? So now apocrine glands. So where do we find these smelly BO glands? Usually they're going to be in the axillary region, armpit, right? Anal and genital areas. So why do we have these? Usually they're associated with hair follicles, okay, those terminal hairs, okay. But what's the purpose of BO or smelly sweat, right? And really it's about signaling information. So when you're trying to figure out attraction to another human, right? It may give you some information about that person's immune system. So it's a subconscious attraction, okay? It's kind of like pheromones a little bit, right? So it's how you can tell maybe a little bit about compatibility in another person, which is very interesting. There's been multiple studies on this, on people finding a mate just through smell, and giving people just, you know, clothes to smell and what you find more attractive just through smell. And there are two other kind of specialized or modified apocrine glands. So apocrine glands are just the ones we find, you know, in our armpits, genital areas, and then these guys are modified apocrine glands. And we find those in our ears. So ceruminous glands produce earwax. Okay, so it's a modified sweat gland, as well as mammary glands. So in our breast tissue, which produces milk. So if you think about it, which is kind of interesting, milk is kind of like sweat. Okay, really interesting, right? So mammary glands are just modified sweat glands. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what goes wrong with the integumentary system. And one thing that can happen is burns. Okay, so how do we classify burns and what's the severity of a burn? So we have our first degree burns, and that's usually maybe a sunburn, you've been out in the sun a little bit too long, and it's really only going to affect the epidermis. Okay, so only the epidermis is damaged, so you're not going to get scarring, maybe a little redness, and it'll be just fine, right? Whereas a second degree burn is going to affect the entire epidermis and the upper part of the dermis. So what happens is, because you're affecting that junction between the epidermis and the dermis, you get blistering. So essentially the epidermis separates from the dermis, and that's what a blister is. And there's going to be accumulation of fluid there. And, second degree burns, that's, a really bad sunburn. Maybe you touch something really hot like the stove and you get a blister, right? Your skin heals very well, so not too bad, right? Whereas third degree burns are the worst, obviously, and it's full thickness of the skin. So all the way through the epidermis and the dermis into the underlying tissue. So this is really where it can be life-threatening, right? So you have a rapid fluid loss, which can cause shock. You can get infection, right? Your skin is very important for protecting your underlying tissues from infection. So if you no longer have that layer of protection, it sets up for infection, right? So very important, those third degree burns and how they're managed. Another problem with the integumentary system is skin cancer. So we have a couple different types of skin cancer, varying from not so bad to very bad, right? So where do these develop from, and how bad are they? Now our first kind is basal cell carcinoma. And these guys are the least malignant and the most common. So these guys are from the stratum basale. So remember, the stratum basale is that mitotically active layer where those cells are dividing. So it can go into the dermis and the hypodermis, so underneath the skin, okay, or underneath the epidermis, okay. But as long as you just get those removed and taken care of, they're not too bad. Our second type is a squamous cell carcinoma. So if you notice by the pictures, the basal cell kind of looks more like a blister, whereas the squamous cell carcinoma is a little more roughened, right? It looks a little worse. So these guys arise from the keratinocytes themselves in that stratum spinosum. So these guys can grow very rapidly and can metastasize if they're not removed very quickly. So these guys are kind of the middle ground. They're not too bad if taken care of very quickly, but they can get worse if not taken care of, okay? So squamous cell carcinoma, and that's in the name. So all these are in the names, right? Basal cell in the basal layer, squamous cell, the keratinocytes are squamous cells, right? Stratified squamous epithelium. And last but not least, melanomas. So these guys are cancers of the melanocytes. Okay, again, in the name, melanoma, melanocytes. Most dangerous type of cancer. So these guys are very invasive, and they can invade the internal organs. Okay, so these guys are nothing to be messed with. Melanomas are very bad. It is interesting, though, my background is in horses, and gray horses can get melanomas very commonly, and they're a lot less invasive in horses. Usually they just stay in the skin, and usually they're okay, and you don't have to do much with them unless they're in a bad area that's invasive in that local area. But gray horses are really known because they have a lot of pigment in their skin. They have very dark skin, and so they're more prone to getting melanomas. So how does skin develop? So in our tissue layer lecture, we talked a lot about the germ lines of tissues, right? So we have these 3 germ lines: the ectoderm on the outside, mesoderm in the middle, and endoderm on the inside. So epidermis, okay, so the epidermis, which is our epithelial tissue, derives from that outer ectoderm. Okay. And then the dermis, which is our connective tissue, and hypodermis, which is also connective tissue, comes from the mesoderm. Okay. So ectoderm and mesoderm is where our skin comes from. So how does skin age, right? So over the years, our skin can become more thin, less elastic. We can get environmental damage, right? With sun exposure, things like that, scarring. We also get a little more inflammation in our skin because we have less protection there. So you have more inflammatory responses by the body. But something interesting too is fetal skin. So when you're developing inside the uterus, there are some protective things that the skin has to do being in that environment, in a liquid environment inside the uterus. And what happens is we actually get this kind of downy hair covering over the entire body. And those little fetal hairs are called lanugo. Okay, so the hair, those little downy hairs kind of protect that developing skin, as well as these fetal sebaceous glands. So they have their own sebaceous glands that produce a very specific substance, and it's called vernix caseosa, and it's kind of this like cheesy like substance. It's a thick protective layer for the skin. It's kind of this waxy substance that helps protect the skin even more from the environment in utero. And so you can appreciate these 2 things usually on some babies that are born. So kind of cool what our skin can do to protect us. So here are our learning objectives for this lecture. So again, kind of go through them, make sure you can answer those questions, make yourself a little study guide for this lecture. And if you have any questions, let me know. So since this is our last lecture of the unit, we do have our first unit exam coming up on Monday the 31st. So I'll send you out a lot more information about it, but it's going to be online from 3 to 4:30. Don't forget about the discussion either on Canvas. That's going to be due this week or by the end of the week before the exam, and that's going to be on vitamin D. And for next time, right, so we're going to go into the skeletal system. So our reading for next week is going to be chapter 6. And here are some study questions for this chapter as well from your textbook if you want some more study questions. So just a little bit about the exam, and again, I'm going to send out more information on it to remind you guys about the first exam, but it will be on Canvas, so it's all online. 60 questions worth 60 points. It's going to be a combination, mostly multiple choice questions, maybe some fill in the blank, short answer, and you will have an hour and a half, so 90 minutes. And all the material from the lectures and from the lab. So don't forget about all the visible body courseware work as well. So definitely make sure you go through that. There's a lot of really good practice quizzes on the lab software. Okay? And again, let me know if you have any questions. All right, see you guys next time.